There was a great deal of anxiety and concern among the royal circles when Queen Victoria passed away on the Isle of Wight inside Osborne House on January 22, 1901. Here is how her actual voice sounded days before her death. Victoria had been in power since June 1837, making her the monarch with the longest reign in British history at the time, at 63 years and 216 days. Her death ends an era in which most of her British subjects know no other monarch. Her 63-year reign saw the growth of an empire on which the sun never set. Victoria restored dignity to the English monarchy and ensured its survival as a ceremonial political institution. How did she come on the throne and what caused her death? Born in 1819, she came to the throne after the death of her uncle, King William IV, in 1837. As a young woman ascending to the throne, her future husband described her as one whose extreme obstinacy was constantly at war with her good nature. Her first Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, became her close friend and advisor, and she succeeded in blocking his replacement by Tory leader Sir Robert Peel in 1839. 2 years later, however, an election resulted in a Tory majority in the House of Commons, and Victoria was compelled to accept Peel as Prime Minister. Never again would she interfere so directly in the politics of democratic Britain. In 1839, her first cousin Albert, a German prince, came to visit the English court at Windsor, and Victoria proposed to him 5 days after his arrival. Prince Albert accepted, and in February 1840 they were married. He soon became the dominant influence in her life and served as her private secretary. Among his greatest achievements as royal consort was his organization of the Great Exhibition of 1851, the first World's Fair, in the Crystal Palace in London. He also steered her support away from the Whigs to the Conservative Tories. She later was a vocal supporter of Benjamin Disraeli, leader of the Conservative Party. Victoria and Albert built royal residences at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight and at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, and became increasingly detached from London. They had 9 children, including Victoria, later the Empress of Germany, and the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII. In 1861, Albert died. Perhaps the most significant turning point in Queen Victoria's life was the death of Prince Albert in December 1861. His death sent Victoria into a deep depression, and Victoria's grief was such that she did not appear in public for 3 years. She wore only black for the rest of her reign, which lasted nearly 64 years. For 3 years after Albert's death, the Queen, who was also just 42 at the time, refused to appear in public, becoming known as the Widow of Windsor. She never entirely got over the loss, and until the end of her life she had her maids nightly lay out Albert's clothes for the next day, and in the morning replace the water in the basin in his room. Victoria died of a cerebral hemorrhage, which is a type of stroke. However, the Queen had been growing weaker for several years before her death. Her eyesight had become clouded by cataracts, and she was a wheelchair user due to her rheumatism. The Queen's doctors found she had suffered from a series of minor strokes, and the end was coming. On her deathbed, she whispered that Turi, her Pomeranian dog, be brought to her. On January 22, 1901 in the evening, she passed away surrounded by her family, including her son, successor, and her oldest grandson, the Kaiser of Germany. Her favorite dog was placed on her deathbed. A state funeral had not been planned in some time, and certainly not one on the size of Victoria's, despite the fact that she had laid down her wishes for her funeral in writing years earlier. No one was still living who could recall the passing of a former king, which put a lot of pressure on the funeral preparations. The Queen was wearing her wedding veil and a white dress when she passed away. However, the burial was already in disarray before the body was even returned to the mainland. When the royal undertakers were called from London, they promptly forgot something crucial, which was one of the first problems with Queen Victoria's funeral and the moments following her passing. A local carpenter on the island was located, and he was responsible for designing and building the Queen's coffin, because they had forgotten it before traveling to the Isle of Wight. Victoria's body was placed inside the coffin when it arrived at Osborne House with the royal undertakers, her family, and other guests. The physicians and dressers placed several souvenirs inside of this wooden box, including one of her husband's dressing gowns and a plaster cast of his hand. In addition, they inserted a lock of John Brown's hair, a wedding ring belonging to John Brown's mother, and a lock of Elizabeth's beloved Scottish attendant. However, Queen Victoria's funeral was set for Saturday, February 2nd, and it would take place at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, but it would be a difficult voyage. The historians and secretaries in the royal family were hurriedly looking up the protocol for a royal funeral, because no one seemed to be aware of it. Additionally, there were no images to serve as references, and it was noted that it was great how ignorant these men were of historical precedent. The moment she passed away, there was panic, yet despite Victoria's particular requests for her funeral, everything went wrong right away. Victoria ordered that her entrails and heart not be removed, nor did she want to be embalmed. Victoria also preferred not to have a death mask made, but due to Kaiser Wilhelm II's insistence, this was done, which was disgusting. Victoria also stated that she preferred a military and state funeral versus lying in state. However, the undertaker also showed up and demanded the Queen's measurements, shocking her family because there was no casket. The Kaiser immediately intervened, insisting that only the family and courtiers should handle Victoria's body and forbidding the undertaker's helper from touching her. The man, who stood by and gave them explicit instructions, ordered the measures to be taken by the Emperor, Sir James Reed, and Bishop Winchester. Victoria was supposed to be buried in a mahogany outer coffin that would have been covered by an oak shell coffin, but this unfortunately did not arrive in time. The Kaiser, King Edward, and Mrs. Tuck, Victoria's hairdresser, allegedly lifted the Queen's body into the coffin after the private doctor for the Queen placed a layer of charcoal on the floor of the coffin. There were other disputes over who had the authority to plan the burial between several nobility and the Lord Chamberlain. However, preparations for Victoria's burial were hurried and completed very fast. Many of Victoria's requests, which astonished those who had known her well, were her desire to be buried respectfully and to have a straightforward burial. She was a woman who predominantly wore black for most of her life, yet she wanted a white burial, a coffin covered in white, and for her country to mourn her while still donning black clothing. However, there was disagreement on what the royal family should wear, as the Queen's granddaughter noted in her account of the situation. There was great worry and bewilderment in the Lord Chamberlain's office, as well as in the royal family, as to what was the correct mourning for the sovereign. It had been 64 years since such a sad occurrence. Nobody knew what to wear, therefore antique prints and images from long past were analyzed to discover how to modernize and update the clunky trappings of it. The Queen's casket was delivered to the Royal Yacht Alberta on February 1st. 40 warships escorted the yacht and fired a salute in honor of it, while the funeral march by Chopin was performed on each ship. Local mourners gathered to witness the ship set sail. The casket was protected all night long by dependable Marines. The King and other royal mourners were aboard the Victoria and Albert, which was beyond the basin. Beyond them was a long line of battleships that formed a dazzling highway over the quiet, black waters of the Solent and extended as far as the eye could see. However, thousands of mourners gathered in London streets on February 2nd, despite it pouring outside, to pay their respects to the Queen's. Around 1,000 fans are thought to have been hurt when there was a crowding to watch the march. However, after arriving in Windsor by rail, a procession from the station to St. George's Chapel began, and that's when everything started to go awry. The gun carriage carrying Victoria's coffin was hauled by the horses, who were shivering badly, but the carriage eventually broke loose and took off running. The procession to the chapel slowed as a result of the issue with the coffin and the horses, which led to some in the crowd becoming restless. You could hear a band playing in the distance, but nothing was occurring, it was reported. Then Queen Alexandra stormed out, glancing in all directions, until Clarendon convinced her to return to the chapel. But after the funeral party arrived at the church, the service went on well. Glorious music, loved by the Queen, rose from the organ and choristers, it was reported of the ceremony. Above the crowd gathered around it, the white coffin with its sparkling crown and orbs was raised onto the bier. The words of hope, peace, and faith of the burial service were said. The herald announced the departure of one mighty sovereign and the accession of King Edward VI, and then gradually the mourners departed, and the banners in the gorgeous array above the dark carved pinnacles of the chancel walls drooped alone over the guardsmen, who, in their bearskins and with arms reversed, remained to watch over the dead. The burial and commitment were to follow, though. The difficult part was transporting the coffin to the royal mausoleum at Frogmore, Windsor, where Prince Albert was interred. A rehearsal was held the day before the burial on February 3rd in order to prevent more embarrassment. But after 2 days of lying in state, she was ultimately buried next to her late husband. However, one last error was made when a person who was thought to be mentally ill entered the service and had to be led out. But it was widely accepted that Queen Victoria intended the funeral to be as simple as possible, with snow falling outdoors as well. Despite all of this uncertainty, it's crucial to remember that Queen Victoria passed away surrounded by her family and loved ones.